Gentle readers, welcome to Everything is Everything. This is a very important episode. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Ajay. Today, we will discuss class. I'm saying it like I'm a school teacher. Today, class, we will discuss what's wrong with Indian media or Indian journalism, whatever you call it. And one of the things that is wrong with it is that this man is not part of it. This man could have been part of it because he was born in a housing enclave, a world famous housing enclave, which is meant entirely for journalists, which is even named after journalists. We won't take the name because we don't want admiring nubile young women to land up at your house if we accidentally give the address away. But you were born in this famous place surrounded by journalists. Tell me more.
Not born, age 6. Okay.
Age 6.
So from age 6 to age 17, I left home at 17. From age 6 to age 17, I lived in a housing complex where there were 80 people who were all Indian media. And therefore, I was surrounded by this invisible knowledge and experience and the everyday rhythm of the world of the Indian media of that period. This was pre-television. So it was all print media. It was people working with newspapers, including Hindi and Marathi and Gujarati newspapers and so on. My father worked for the Economic Times. If that seems strange to you, that was a different world where the Economic Times actually had a meaningful, serious research department. It was called the ETRB, the Economic Times Research Bureau. And my father was the second head of the ETRB. It was created by K.A. Antony, previously of the RBI, who brought my father into it. And when Antony died, my father succeeded him as the head of the ETRB. It was an age where top flight economists such as Hanan Ezekiel, brother of the much more famous Nissim Ezekiel, but really one of the best economists of India, was editor of the Economic Times. Okay, that was the kind of talent pool that was to be found in journalism in that age. And so, because my father worked for the Economic Times, I was a resident of a housing complex with 80 people, 80 households who were all Indian media. So that's my ancient connection to the media.
So tell me about the journalists you hung out with, the journalists who were your dad's friends. Were they good people? What did you think of them? What did you think of journalism? Was it to you a noble calling and these are important people in the intellectual life of a country or something else?
So it was fully a noble calling. It was about being good, valuable participants in the emergence of a good society. So it was very much imbued with a sense of purpose. And for example, defining events of that period were the emergency and the censorship. So I was 10 when the emergency happened, and there was just this entire fervor around government control of freedom of expression. Gentle reader, you may not have heard these stories. The Indian Express carried empty white space saying, we refuse to publish something that the censors have not allowed us to write. We're not going to become toadies to the government and write what the government wants us to write. We'd rather go with empty space. That was the symbolism of making a protest. Similarly, Arun Shuri was at the Indian Express, and there was a front page, full page investigative journalism piece about A.R. Antule, who was Maharashtra Chief Minister at the time, and it discovered some of the misdeeds around his trusts, which ultimately led to him losing his job as a chief minister. That was the level at which India played in those days. So journalists were poorly paid, and there was not a whole lot of cash flow or profit in that world, but there was a sense of purpose. And I think that the media interacted with the society in an interesting and meaningful way. While on this subject, some of the top intellectuals of the country were editors of newspapers. Like I described, Hanan Ezekiel in the Economic Times was a top economist. The Times of India grew up around Shamlal and Girilal Jain, and these were people who wrote opinion pieces that would be incomprehensible to most people today. But those opinion pieces mattered. It's like the whole country read those pieces and cared about them. So they had a level of intellectual influence that makes you think of like philosophers in France in the 60s, in exactly the way that people today would say that, where are the French philosophers today? In that same fashion, these were the philosophers that shaped the collective consciousness, and they were an integral part of that good India, which in many ways we have lost.
So I didn't know such a thing was possible, but can you feel nostalgic for something that happened before your time? Because sometimes I do, but in a sense, it's a selective nostalgia. Also, everything was not so rosy then, as we will discuss. But these are salutary tales indeed.
Amit, you've also been in journalism much later. What was it like for you? What did you see? I'm sure you came in a much more complicated world.
So I was sort of an accidental journalist. In the 1990s, I did television for the first 5, 6 years of my working life, tried to be an entrepreneur, failed at that. Circa 2001, really got into journalism, though I'd written random pieces for people before that. And through the first decade of the aughties, that was my like my last full time job was as a managing editor at Cricinfo. So I was running what you might say the editorial side of a new media company, and I did that for a few years. And around that time, my blog really took off. I got offers to write columns. I wrote for foreign papers like the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian. But I have been a columnist at some point or the other for pretty much every major Indian newspaper. Times of India, Mint, Economic Times, etc., etc. I've basically written for everyone. But those were columns. And that was one particular function. And even as a managing editor at Cricinfo, that was a different kind of function. I didn't come up the traditional way through the newsroom, going on a particular city beat, doing a beat for 5 years, etc., etc. I didn't pay my dues in that way. As a columnist, I performed one function, which is an important function, but it's only one of many functions of journalism and media, which is sense making. I call it sense making. I think there's a space for it in the modern world. I think many people regard us as sense makers, which is why we take the show and our work so seriously.
Explain.
Sense makers is that the world is complicated, many things are happening. What frameworks do you use to think about it? Something extremely confusing has happened. How do you make sense of it? How do you look at it? And sense makers are people who help you do that. And earlier that was a function that could only be performed by journalism and in a longer time scale by books. And today that's not really the case, but we'll come to all of that later. So that was kind of what I did. So I was an outsider. Like in every field that I have been, I have fundamentally been an outsider, but a partial outsider. Partial outsider is a phrase by Janan Ganesh, used it in FT recently. And the phrase basically means someone who is an outsider but still has some connection within that world. So they are not without influence, but because they are outsiders, they don't buy the conventional thinking. They are not enslaved by the conventions and the mores of that particular field. And they can take a step outside and apply other frameworks to it and look at it that way. And I think one of my great advantages in understanding the world and in figuring out what I'm doing and finding purpose is I'm a partial outsider to everything that I've been involved in, including journalism. So the views that I am coming with, in a sense, are not from a complete insider. I'm a partial outsider, but at the same time, I've had a long, long time to think about these. Also, for the purpose of this episode, once we decided let's do this episode, I decided to speak to three friends of mine who've all been guests on the Seen and the Unseen and are great minds on exactly this subject, media and Indian media. One of them is Prem Panikkar. He's got 2 or 3 episodes with me. They're really good. Veteran founding managing editor of Rediff in the 90s and a legend essentially in the field. And the other two are Shefali Bhatt and Samarth Bansal, much younger journalists. And Prem, I find all of them very wise. They've all been on the Seen and the Unseen. So thought that, and I've discussed all of these subjects with them in the past, but I thought to synthesize my thoughts, I need to have conversations again. So if there's anything good in this episode that you like, you can give them the credit for it. And if there's something you don't agree with, just assume, oh, it's Amit again, he's taking off.
The mighty podcaster who will not join any club that will have him.
Well, I'm really glad for once that you quoted the right Marx. This, of course, is Groucho Marx, right? So, well done.
Okay, Amit, so show us the broad direction that we're going to go today in obtaining some understanding of how and why the Indian media broke.
Right. So over here, gentle readers, you see a table of contents, and essentially there are 8 chapters, and I want to speak about 8 crises. And there's a 9th chapter which talks about the future. And you, gentle readers, can see it. Ajay can't because there's nothing here for him, right? But anyway, you've kind of seen my notes and you know what we're talking about. So these are the divisions I have made. Just my particular way of dividing this content and framing it and giving it some kind of narrative. So let's get started. So I want to start by getting a little meta and by thinking about journalism itself. How did it originate? Why did it originate? Why does it exist? We think of journalism often as what it is when we are growing up. So we have a picture of journalism in our heads, that there are newsrooms and newsrooms are doing things, and then they come out in those broadsheet newspapers, and then there are television channels and there are news shows happening, and we think that's a picture of journalism, and it's always been thus. And whatever values we perceive in it, whatever importance we give it, has always been there. That's what we imagine. But if you really think about journalism, ask the fundamental question, why does it exist? And where did it come from? And to go back, to think about the origins of journalism, you can go back to before the written word came about. You had town criers, you had poets who would remember oral histories and pass them on through the days, and etc., etc. And what was happening there was information was being passed on. There was a sense, number one, that something is happening in the world and people need to know. And number two, that something that has happened needs to be preserved. And often number three, that dialogues need to have to be had about it. So let us have these conversations in the public square. So journalism has been around for a much longer time than journalistic outlets have been around, or even the printing press has been around. There is a need. There is a need for information. There is a need for seeking truth, and that is what is playing out, right? And in modern times, journalism gradually, evolved from, number one, the search for information. Things are happening, you want to know what's happening, you expand your world, and therefore journalism. Then that goes a little deeper, where it becomes a quest for truth. Many things are happening. What is true? What is important? How should you look at it? So then there is truth, and then that is followed by what I call sense making. It's a term I made up for, the purpose of thinking about the world today, but the function has always kind of existed, and therefore you have the people who make sense. But then a function evolves, and it's really in the 20th century that we get these new functions, that journalism becomes like a watchdog, and higher values enter into it, and I'll speak about that in a future chapter. And so it's evolving and is fulfilling all of these functions gradually. It is the first draft of history, as it is often called. And it's interesting that the first journalist is supposed to be Thucydides, I think that's how you pronounce his name, an ancient historian. And he was a historian who gave a lot of value on fact checking, on on verifying and checking all his sources and all of that. And the same values apply to journalists. People say he was the first journalist because of the methods and the rigor which he used. And so that's where journalism is. It's information, it's truth, it's being a watchdog, etc., etc. But how many of these are still relevant today in the same way? If you think about information, information was once a scarce resource. You did not know what happened in the next neighborhood. The town crier would say something in the public square in the evening, and you'd get a tiny nugget of it. It was very scarce, and therefore it was valued, and therefore the people who brought it to you were valued. Today, information is abundant. There is practically too much information. It is no longer a scarce resource. I remember when I started doing cricket journalism in the early 2000s, cricket journalism had just changed radically. Because earlier, when you would write for a newspaper, a match report would have to tell the reader what happened. But by the time I came to the business and started writing, a match report would not need to do that. Like if you, and the British journalists were the pioneers in this regard, if you read the cricket pages of the Guardian and the Telegraph and the Times, they would not need to do that because the viewer had already watched it on television, or at least knew what had happened. So that those ball by ball details of this happened, then that wicket fell, it was a commodity, it was freely available. And therefore, the mandate of the cricket journalist changed, that you have to give perspective, you have to bring color, you have to do other things. The style of writing changed, and the experience became much richer, which is just one small way in which that particular mandate changed. But today the question is that we are surrounded by information everywhere. We are surrounded by sense makers everywhere. And as I shall relate later, in many cases, those sense makers are much better than those that you find in traditional journalism, because they are specialists, whereas journalists tend to be generalists. I'll come back to that. So the question then is that what is journalism doing out there? The reasons that it came about no longer exist. They are taken care of. So like an artifact, those old structures, those old journalistic structures, those old institutions remain. And then the question is that something's got to give. So this is something that we need to think about, that we might bemoan that, oh, people have stopped consuming journalism, they are swiping on Instagram, attention is fragmented, etc., etc. All of that is true, but this is not the people's fault. What the people go to journalism for, though, those needs are being served in other ways. And therefore, we need to just rethink whether that old shape is relevant, what a new shape should be, and the implications that has for our society. So I'm throwing up a question here. There is no solution here, and the problems come later in this episode, even though I'm calling it the crisis of relevance, but it bears thinking about that. Why do you do what you do?
I'm sure you'll come back to this later, and maybe this is just a classification scheme. When you say that information is plentiful, but side by side with that, the truth is not plentiful. In fact, in the hosepipe of information, there is a great deal of rubbish. Okay, so corporations organize themselves to lie to the people, governments organize themselves to lie to the people, political parties organize themselves to lie to the people, and a variety of tribalistic nonsense emerged like anti-vax sentiment. So, in fact, to me today, the public square is deluged with nonsense. And then, when a newspaper, when a media outlet is able to perform these services of the hard work, the fact checking, the rigorous process, and of speaking the truth, that in fact continues to be compelling and command a lot of power. So, where do you fit it into the terminology that you just used?
All of those functions of being filters. For example, what should a good newspaper be? A good newspaper should be a filter to the truth. You have a lot of information, a lot of it is crap, like you said. A good newspaper should be a filter which gets you to the truth, and that's what it should be. We are in a world where there is no consensus on truth anymore, effectively. In the 1980s and 90s, when we grew up, there was a broad consensus on the truth. Everybody kinda agreed that the earth is round and goes around the sun, and etc., etc., which I think hopefully people still agree. But there was a broad sense that this is a shared world. You might have ideological differences on the margin, say, between a New York Times and a Wall Street Journal, but those are much smaller than you think. And those differences were also on the opinion pages. The news pages were separate, and both were known for their rigorous reporting. And I'll come back to values in the next chapter. And that world has disappeared. We no longer have a consensus on truth. We are surrounded by narrative battles everywhere, and that's just how it is. But what I will also say is that mainstream media has abdicated its original function really badly, and it's sad how that has happened. They've standards have dropped. Again, I'll talk about that later. And also the function of being worthy filters is for me the most effective filters that I trust are not mainstream media, but individuals that I follow, whether I'm reading the newsletters on Substack, whether I'm reading, say, a blog like Marginal Revolution by Tyler and Alex, whether I'm following people I admire on Twitter, etc., etc. So over a period of time, you kind of get a sense of your own filters and so on and so forth. So this is a function that the media could have performed, but it's abdicated that role, and in any case, to some extent, the ship has sailed. So from the crisis of relevance, we come to the crisis of purpose. As individuals, we think a lot about purpose. We are often driven by purpose. Many of the people who do our course life lessons or who come to us for advice will often ask us, how do I find purpose in life? I feel a little empty without that. Now, once upon a time, I used to think that journalism is purposeful, that there is a purpose there. But there's a dichotomy, and this is a dichotomy that I've discussed with all these guests who've come on my show to talk about media, and no one really has a good answer to it. And the dichotomy is this, that you imagine that every profession has a dharma, right? I'm using the word loosely. So doctors have a particular kind of dharma, and writers have a particular kind of dharma, and there is something like that to journalism. Now, this is a relatively new conception, right? Until, say, the start of the 20th century, you had a lot of journalism which was gossipy, tabloidy stuff, including in the West. And a lot was about supply responding to demand, and the demand could be for all kinds of things. Around the turn of the century, 20th century, and then through the 20th century, there evolved this sense that there are higher purposes to journalism. Truth seeking, of course, is one of them. Speaking truth to power is one of them. Afflicting the comfortable, comforting the afflicted is one of them. And it's very interesting that, there's an editor of a major Indian newspaper who actually told one of the journalists I spoke to that I believe that our job is to comfort the comforted. And he meant it seriously, and it was a rational statement. And given what we'll talk about in the next couple of chapters, you'll understand exactly where that is coming from. So on the one hand, there is that sense of purpose, that it's a higher calling. As you said, many of the 80 people that who lived in that housing society with you had that sense of higher calling. I'm pretty sure your father did as well. And on the other hand, the fact of the matter is that it is a business. You have to be responsible to your stakeholders, to your shareholders. You have to make sure your employees have jobs. For that, your company has to make money. And that bottom line is something that matters. You can't ignore it. You can't be too idealistic about it. You're not performing charity. You have to run a business. And these two in some way come up against each other. Now, people like you and I, idealistic as we are, believe in doing the work that we do, and we'll figure out a way to make it make money for us, but we won't compromise. We'll do what we do. As individuals, that is how we think. But if you're running a firm, can you afford to think like that? Are you performing your fiduciary duties to your shareholders if you, don't maximize the profit that you're making? And this becomes a big issue. Like, when I spoke to Shefali, she told me that when she joined her first job as a journalist in her early 20s, I think in a financial newsroom, she felt that the newsroom was a cost center. The company treated them as cost centers, and there was always a sense that we are spending money on this. We need to see where the returns are. Why are we even, otherwise going to spend money on you people? That you people are not the purpose we exist. The purpose we exist is something else entirely. Vineet Jain famously said to the New Yorker, we are not in the news business, we are in the advertising business. The focus is not the news, the focus is the advertising. And for many big media companies, in fact, news is very secondary or tertiary by this point in time. So the focus then became that how do we make money, and that became the sense of purpose. Prem told me the story about a time where he was a managing editor at Yahoo. Now, when he took over at Yahoo India as the editorial head, circa 2009, 2010, he did a lot of wonderful things. And as a freelancer, I edited a columns page for him. I put together a columns page with a lot of names you'll recognize, like Nitin Pai, Sanjay Sipai Malani, Jai Arjun Singh, etc., etc. I thought I did a really good job getting people. Getting a wide group of people together there. So Prem was doing very unusual things and promoting also something called originals, which was long form reporting, and etc., etc. And the target that was set for the India guys was, we want 500 million page views a month. This was a target that was set for them. And at one point, he realized that there is one section, which I think was called OMG, which on its own was getting 450 million, 500 million page views a month. And what was this section? Basically, they had hired a guy in Bombay who was a photographer who would go to Bollywood parties, take photographs and send them here, and they would publish these photographs with a caption. And they were paying that guy 1 lakh a month retainer, and he would just go to every party every day. And you'll find versions of this on Instagram now. And they would publish that, and they'd get their 500 million page views from there. And his annual cost was 12 lakhs, therefore. Whereas Prem's originals department annual budget was, I think, more than 1 crore, and etc., etc. And those stories, like deeply researched, long form pieces, many of which went on to win awards, would get 40,000, 50,000 page views and not more than that. And basically, the higher ups came to Prem and said, what the fuck are you doing? With that kind of investment, we are getting these kind of page views. Your ROI doesn't compare. It's a waste of money. And so eventually everything got shut down, and Yahoo kind of went in that direction, right? So this is really kind of something that took center stage, and it took center stage in a sense in this century, and I'll share the reasons why. Because we reached what is going to be the subject of our next episode, which is a crisis of money. You could no longer take profitability for granted. If you were a media house, you could no longer say, oh, I'm printing a newspaper and so many households will subscribe to it, and I have all these captive eyeballs, and I'll get advertisers, and I'll make money, and I'll run the newspaper the way it is, and I'll invest in journalists, and etc., etc. You could no longer do that. That has changed in the last 25 years.
Okay, and then tell us about the money.
So let me open this chapter with a narrative of what actually happened. What happened in the early 2000s was that the internet became big and many traditional media houses decided that they have to shift online because that is where attention is going. More and more people are spending more and more time online. That's where they'll make their money. Now, the issue there was that when it came to figuring out how to make money, you had one model, which was advertising. Obviously, micropayments weren't a thing then. No one was subscribing to anything per se. People expected content to be free to the extent that you first got digital music on Napster, which was expected to be free. Nobody thought you'll be paying for music one day or paying for anything one day. So advertising was the only game in town. Now, how do you make money? You make money by accumulating, aggregating attention and selling that to advertisers. What is a unit of that? The unit of that was considered to be the page view. So the whole game was multiply page views. Like Prem's story is from 2010, but that same mindset has persisted almost to this day, basically. So it was all about page views. So all your big media houses set up their sites and they're all about page views. And in really weird ways, like I remember there were sites which would do this thing called pagination. Pagination was if you have an 800 word piece, you break it up into 4 pages of 200 words each. And they used to justify this in the day by so that you get 4 page views if somebody reads that entire story. So you read one para and then click next page, one para, click next page. You'll still find this on some sites, right? And they would justify this by saying that, oh, the readers, you should not make the reader scroll. This was one random principle that came up in those years. And remember, I was editing a big internet site, Cricinfo. So I was in the thick of things at that time. And it was conventional wisdom that don't make the reader scroll. And I did not buy that. I said that is bullshit. If you give the reader content, she will scroll. If you keep her attention, if you make her interesting, if you give her quality, she will scroll as much as you want her to scroll. It is in fact rude to make the reader click again. You have to make life as easy for the reader as possible. Don't make them click too much, no pop-ups, no this, no that, etc., etc. So I was kind of an idealist in that sense. So at Cricinfo, we didn't do pagination and we didn't go in for all of that in that time. But pagination was a big thing. Now, what happened here is that the internet began to proliferate, more and more sites began to come up. As more and more sites began to come up, page views became a dime a dozen. There were suddenly many, many more page views. Now, in the same way that in the economy, if you increase the money supply, inflation happens, the value of a rupee goes down. So in a similar sense, the value of a page view goes down. So now it's a race to the bottom. You have to try harder and harder. Everything becomes clickbait. Everything's becomes SEO. I remember I used to write for one of our biggest newspapers a column, and this was not even in the early days. This was like 2014, 2015 onwards to 2020. And when they would publish whatever I wrote for them online, they would insist on an SEO friendly headline, which was just a banal collection of words which they expected people to search for, and etc., etc. And the thinking was firstly all wrong. All their assumptions was wrong. A lot of their assumptions about what works and what doesn't for clicks was wrong. We know that now, and I knew that then. But regardless of that, that simply doesn't work because that metric was just gamed. It was rampantly gamed, and less money started going to that, and more money, advertising money, started going elsewhere. Where? Now that is where the next phase happens. This is something that Samarth told me about in some detail, where he spoke about something that happens between 2010 and 2020 for about 10 years, which is that all of these digital sites doing interesting, important work, which mainstream media give up on, come about, like Vox, like Vice, like BuzzFeed, whether or not you like them, they come about. And the promise given to them by the platforms is that you give us original digital content, we will give you page views. We will send people your way, and then you make money of advertising. Right? And that seemed to be working for 10 years. It was a great big hope. But what actually happened, and the reason it petered out, some of them survived today, some of them died. The reason it petered out was that all of the advertising actually went to the platforms. All the advertising went to Facebook, they make money from it. All the advertising went to YouTube, they make money from it. All the advertising went to Instagram, they make money for it. And there was no money left over for the people who were actually producing this content, and they were like, hey, what the fuck happened? And, this was a dream. And here I want to go off on a bit of a sideways rant. And there are two aspects to this. One is something that advertisers have been aware of for decades. John Wanamaker, an advertising legend, once said that half the money we spend on advertising is wasted. We don't know which half. Right? I had Ambi Parmeswaran, an Indian ad legend, on the scene and the unseen, and he said to me, number one is much more than half. And number two, what is happening online is a scandal. He said, what we do online as advertisers is pray and pray. That was the phrase he used. It's not working. It doesn't matter how cheap it gets, how much you spend, where you go, it is simply not working. So that is part one of my rant. Part two of my rant, and it's a deeper thought, is that if advertising isn't dead, it will die. And certainly for media, it is dead. And here's what I mean. And I've spoken about this in the context of the creator economy, right? So from the perspective of a creator, the story I tell is this, that if I am writing a piece in the 1990s, right, I will go to a Times of India. And there are many issues with that, like that they are the gatekeeper. I have to perform to the news cycle. I have to perform to a particular form of 800 words, etc., etc. But I go to the Times of India. They buy my piece. They buy many pieces like my piece. They use it to aggregate eyeballs, and then they sell those eyeballs to advertisers, and I get a tiny chunk of it. Now, in the modern world, that's completely broken down, and I think it is awesome that it has broken down, because what now happens is I don't need the Times of India and I don't need advertisers. I can go directly to my audience and monetize my audience. And that's exactly what I've done for the seen and the unseen. And even for this show, in a sense, this show actually doesn't make money per se, like peanuts on advertising through YouTube. But we sell our life lessons course, and there are many other ways of getting your communities, capturing some of the value that your community places on you. And that was one of the great puzzles of that age, right? Here's the thing. If you write something in 1995 and I'm reading you in the Business Standard, I'm actually spending money reading you, firstly, because time and attention are both scarce resources. Time is money. So just by reading you, or just by sitting and listening to you, I'm actually spending money. I am valuing you. But there is no way for you to capture some of that value. Today there is. Now, you and I as creators don't actually, we could do 100 more things for revenue. We don't, for different reasons. But today it is possible to start monetizing some of the value that people place on you. And that's beautiful. But the question that then arises is, what happens to advertising? The whole way in which brands could go to people is kind of disappearing. You could say that it's still alive on the platforms, like, you'll still find advertising on a YouTube or an Instagram or whatever. And I've bought so many things on Instagram because of advertising. But the thing is that for mainstream media, it is no longer relevant. Mainstream media is an artifact. Advertising may well be an artifact. So the question that then comes up is, how do we think about this? So two things happened, as you can see, in the 2000s. One, it became much harder to make money. Two, because it became harder to make money, that became an existential threat. And therefore, the focus shifted even more hard to making money, and you looked at journalists as cost centers. And number three, what happened was that this affected your purpose in even more devious ways downstream, because when you look at journalists as a cost center, you start sacking them. And you'll sack the senior people first because you're paying them the most, which means perhaps the wisest people in a newspaper who could be mentors, the good editors, you're going to lose some of them. But also what happens is you start losing beats, right? And let me elaborate on this a little bit, that earlier, let's say you had a newspaper, you had a certain circulation that would happen. If it looked meaty, that was great. If you had more pages, you had more pages to sell advertising on. And therefore, you could put in a lot of stuff without realizing it works or not, just because it is worthy to do. Right. So back in the day, newspapers would have books page, arts page, very often not, but there was a golden age. I remember when Prem Panikkar was in the Indian Post, when they had all of these things, and they'd have beats. They'd have city beats. You'd have a municipality beat. You'd have an RBI beat. You'd have people covering those specific beats and working hard. Right. And what those beats did, and I'll go back to the sense of purpose there, is that there was a civic purpose to these beats. As Samarth says, that's a term he uses. There was a civic purpose. And the purpose was that this stuff is important. No one's going to pay for it. No one's even going to demand it. But this stuff is important. Why? Because these go into the record of history. They are there forever. You are writing this first draft of history, which will often be the only draft of history. What is happening in the municipality? in my lane at four bungalows outside Andheri, is there a water problem? What is going on? What was a fight between gundas over there? What is a controversy with the flyover that is being built? What is happening at that construction site? Is there too much dust pollution? Who's covering all of this? And you used to have these beats. Now, what happened when media houses started cutting down on their cost center journalists is that these beats started vanishing. That you would just say, ki, okay, we don't need an RBI beat and we don't need a private bank's beat or whatever, and we'll just have one guy who will do all of this. And oh, that guy's also got to cover some other random subject. And more, journalists became generalists. You no longer had a specialist who knew a beat well, who would focus only on it, who might take 2 weeks to write a big story. But instead, you'd have generalists who would cover 5 different things. And then they would have to do 3 stories a day because here you got to maximize output, ROI, etc. And that started happening more and more. And this sent journalism into a vicious spiral. Your quality got lower, your readership got lower, and all of this happened. And why did these beats go? The reason for these beats going, or the reason for all of this getting cut, is ironically what that beautiful thing called technology allowed you. Because technology allowed you to figure out what do people want. People want pictures from Bollywood parties in Bombay. That's getting you 500 million page views a month. People don't want long form stories on coastal erosion of the coast of Tamil Nadu. They don't want that. So the natural response is that you cut that. You don't do that kind of reporting. You focus on where the money is, and you do more and more of this. And that's one of the knock-on effects that happened. And you see how it forms a vicious cycle. You keep chasing money, you get desperate, you save costs where you can, your quality goes lower, and so on and so forth. And this is kind of the cycle that really played out.
I want to add two things to all the things that you just said. A very big milestone in my mind is the recent changes in Google, where Google has gone from being a search engine to being an AI-based summary. So earlier, the Faustian bargain that the media sites made with Google was, I'll give you free access to crawl my content and you'll bring traffic my way. And that was a fair deal. So people at least got clicks, they got their page views, because a customer would first go to Google and then come to your site. But now Google has basically put Google Gemini LLM powered answer at the top of every search page. So Google search now is first a Google Gemini response and then the traditional Google search response. And the rate of click-throughs that go back to media sites has absolutely collapsed. So if you ever had economics around counting page views, counting clicks, attribution counting, click that led to a sale, all those things have just got a body blow because of the way Google has re-engineered itself. And I think whatever financial viability the media achieved in the post-Google world has just been challenged in a fundamental way. The second thing that we should think more about is the word attributability. Advertising was always a black art, that you engaged in certain kinds of advertising and you never knew what was its impact. In the modern world, it is possible to be a bean counter and count click-throughs. That if a click led to a sale, then I'll pay for it, else I will not. And it is indeed possible to do that. And so you put up a shirt on Instagram and you watch for the clicks, which didn't just go back to an e-com media page, but went all the way to consummating a transaction. And when that transaction happens, you pay 10 rupees to that creator. You can do that. But as with so many other fields, this quest for attributability is also shrinking the imagination because it's elementary. There's much more to a business, there's much more to a brand than a narrow search for attributability. So at first, I felt that people loved the attributability of modern digital e-com environment. But when you pause to think about it, there is much more to building a business and gaining visibility for the business and creating that environment of trust around the business than merely doing attributability.
Let me also elaborate on a couple of subtler points which I've spoken about before from a different perspective. And one, let's stay with advertising for a moment. I'll come to other ways of making money like subscriptions and so on after this. But for a moment, let's stay with advertising. Advertising doesn't distinguish, or at least the way people look at advertising in India, it doesn't distinguish between shallow engagement and deep engagement. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, let me take you back to something that I've been saying for a long time, and about audio podcasts. Like when The Seen and the Unseen became popular, at one point I said that I would rather have 100,000 downloads of The Seen and the Unseen than 20 million views of a YouTube show that I do. And my reason was that for that YouTube show, if I'm getting 20 million views, it is very, very likely that the average view time of each video is 15 seconds or 10 seconds. Whereas my average session time for a Seen Unseen episode was 40 minutes, and people heard over multiple sessions. So the engagement was off the charts. In fact, it was so high that if you told me this figure in the aughties when I was an internet professional, I would have assumed you were lying. You know, maybe a deeply immersive video game can have session lengths like this. But today, long form podcasts do, because it is deeply immersive and people are listening at higher speeds, etc., right? And the distinction here is between, there is a quality of engagement. That if your engagement is shallow, that viewer is not worth much to you. They are not going to buy your products. Their attention is so diffused at that moment in time that they're not even going to remember the advertising. The advertising won't work, right? So I am in one state of mind where, say, I'm looking at some Bollywood pap like Khushi Mukherjee insisting that she did wear underwear under her black dress, which has been a recent controversy for a couple of weeks. So that is shallow attention. I don't really care about any of the parties involved, whether it is Khushi Mukherjee or the underwear brand or whoever's advertising is on that banner. And of course, I have ad blockers enabled as well. So what even is the value of that page view? Though that doesn't matter, because obviously advertisers will look at how much is served. But there's no value to that. But when I engage with a deep piece of content, like I would imagine if someone is listening to my show and there is advertising there, you know, their attention is a little deeper. If I am reading out a commercial, or let me not bring myself into it, if a podcaster I admire like Alex Fridman is reading out a commercial or telling me something about a brand, the amount of credibility that has is greater. So I think people just look at page views as a unit, and they haven't gone a little deeper at what is the quality of a page view and what are the metrics by which you figure that out. And of course, all metrics can be gamed in different ways, but I think that's an important distinction to make, and advertisers haven't woken up to that because everybody is kind of skimming the surface of understanding. Subscriptions, right? Earlier I said that the key for any creator, and a media house after all is a creator, it's creating a lot of content. The key for any creator is that you monetize a community directly. And therefore, that should happen through subscriptions. And it's happened a little bit in the West, but even there is kind of diffused. For example, the New York Times has a successful subscription model. It's working for them, it's keeping them afloat. But a huge chunk of their money, from what both Shefali and Samarth were telling me, actually comes from their games vertical and their food vertical. A relatively smaller portion of it comes from their actual news and the journalism that they do. And who is to say that at some point the Vineet Jain equivalent over there won't say that, hey, we are in the games business or we are in the food business, we are not in the news business. And it would be a rational thing to say, because as a business, that is where their revenues are indeed coming from. But whatever, subscriptions have been tried in the West. And my question to Samarth was that, tell me, why hasn't it happened in India? Because I know from my own experience as a solo creator that people are willing to pay for things that they value. And Samarth's point was great. His point was that over here, the ecosystem is so shallow that there isn't a large enough sample size for people actually experimenting with doing new things. That you will have 2 or 3 people try subscriptions here and they will fail, and you will assume, oh, the Indian consumer is not ready for it. You don't have a different variety of experiments happening with different models. Right. And when he said this, I immediately said, yeah, shallow ecosystem. And this goes to questions of quality that we will examine in the next chapter. So that hasn't taken off here for some reason. And I believe that there is great scope for it. And you will find media houses like there's one media house which is not in the business of news per se, but in the business of events. They'll organize events and they'll organize fancy conclaves, and that is a revenue stream. And the brand that they built up from their journalism, it's really something that they're using for that and monetizing for that. And then you also have to question that, why can't they make money in other ways? Is the model wrong? Or do people not value them enough? If people don't value them enough, why don't people value them enough? How do we fix that? Many of these are open questions. I'm not claiming to have an answer. And one thing I should point out here is that For me, I am not looking at this story as black and white, that there are heroes and there are villains. I've quoted Vineet Jain as saying something which I'm looking at as a value free statement, in the sense that I'm not saying he's right or he's wrong or he's good or he's bad. I'm just saying this is what he said. This is the fact of the matter. There are no villains in this story. We'll talk about incentives later and the crisis it creates. We'll talk about the structure of the industry. So this is just the way it is. And there are no easy answers. We'll try to think of a few ways forward in our last chapter, but there are no easy answers.
Amit, in this, as a child that grew up around a large number of people ultimately employed by Bennett Coleman and Company, I remember there was a long period in India where the rough thumb rule was that Bennett Coleman and Company makes money and the sum total of everybody else is zero. So some of them make money, some of them lose money, and it all adds up to zero. Then I watched as Bennett Coleman placed a very big bet on tabloidization, on scale, on like shrinking the quality of the paper, and trying for the internet age and the internet transformation with clickbait. And by and large, it hasn't worked well. There's been a significant decline in the operating profit of Bennett Coleman and Company. So I thought that was a really important and historic journey of the Indian media, that if there was anybody who could pull off a loud clickbait, clicks based revenue model, it was Bennett Coleman. Okay, they had that DNA, they had the capability, they had the size and punch in relevant markets to get to those billions of clicks. And they tried and it didn't work. So I find it like really the cleanest repudiation of the idea that there is a way to square this circle. With all the others, you could have said, look, you were a loser anyway. You were really not making money. And so whether in the old ways or in the new ways, there is no deal and that's on you. But for me, it was a huge learning experience around the business models of journalism. When Bennett Coleman went all in on like appealing to the masses and going for clickbait and playing for an advertising-led business model, and it did not work.
And it cannot work. Like, it would have worked in the limited sense that they did clickbait and they would have gotten clicks. Would those clicks have made them money? What is a long-term game that is playing out? What is being devalued here? What is being lost? That long-term game they could never have won. And I was saying this 20 years ago, but no one listened to me then.
I'm reminded of your cutting edge ideas around cricket, where you were 20 years ahead of the people. And what was your single biggest blunder, Mr. Varma?
What was my single biggest blunder?
You did not write it.
I wrote it. There are columns all the way back to 2009. We have a YouTube episode of the show.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to be sure that there is a URL saying 2009 by you about the click.
For cricket strategy, there are many older ones. For clickbait, let's just say that every editor who's worked with me as a columnist would know how opposed I was to doing clickbaity things and how much I would fight. But let me not go into those stories here.
Okay, Amit, we have a crisis of money. How does that turn into a crisis of quality?
Partly the crisis of quality is exacerbated by money, but it's not caused by the money issue per se. Like when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, my impression of journalism was that journalism is where the rejects of society go. आप इंजीनियरिंग नहीं कर सके, मेडिकल में आपका एडमिशन नहीं हुआ, यूपीएससी आपने दी 5 बार, कुछ नहीं हुआ, पैंचो जर्नलिस्ट बन गए. And I would, and I have worked with so many of these old school journalists in my time, and unfortunately I really regret it, but I was pretty arrogant with some of them because I couldn't write a sentence of English. There was a very noted journalist in the Hindu who was once covering a cricket match with me. So I remember in the Chinnaswamy Stadium in Bangalore, he once sidled up to me, very nice guy. And he asked me, Amit, tell me something. Is nevertheless 2 words or 3 words? Right? You had absolutely abysmal standards. Now, we remember the big names from that era. You took some of those big names, Arun Shori and the like, absolute legend. I can come up with other names, like even people who are doyens today, like, Veer Sanghvi, great writer, very good editor at Sunday. Sunday was such a kick-ass magazine with great political reportage. Especially, you had Arun Puri building India Today, which was known in those days for the quality of its copy editing, led by Dilip Bob. Our friend Salil Tripathi was an early cub reporter with them and learnt his craft there. But these are outliers. This is a selection bias playing out in our memory. We remember the good names. The quality of journalism was actually abysmal, and the ecosystem was small. And the result of this creates a vicious cycle. You're producing crap work, so the public expects crap work. Like, they don't know it's crap. They think ki aisa hi hai. And this is pre-internet. So you can't, you're not getting the best of the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Economist. You're not getting all of those. All you see is what you get here. And therefore, your values are skewed by that. And it creates a vicious cycle that because the bar is set so low and you expect so little, that you get so little. There is no striving to be better. There is no striving for a different frontier. And this, of course, as the internet opens, we get exposed to more and more, and this begins to change. But what has then happened since then in the 2000s is that you have this drive towards money. You have this looking at journalists as cost centers. If you listen to my episode with Shefali, parts of it are very moving. And even the conversation I had with her before recording this, where she speaks about how her sense of purpose came from inside, came from individuals. One woman once told her early on in her formative years that, bete, aap jo bhi karo na, just make sure kisi ka bhala ho. And that is how she interpreted journalism as being a good calling for her. Because with good journalism, you can do good for society, you can make a difference, and if you look at Shefali journalism, the long form work she's done, outstanding. So, but that sense of purpose came from individuals. What Shefali told me as well is that most people around her did not share that sense of purpose. By and large, people were mediocre. It was dispiriting. Samarth told me that, and he was very angry about this. He said that journalists in mainstream media are not held accountable for writing bad stories or for making mistakes and all that, which leads to a trust deficit I shall also talk about. And Samarth also pointed out a phenomenon he has seen in the last 5 years. He's saying in the last 5 years, he has seen a lot of really smart people leaving journalism. He calls it the invisible quitting. He says it won't make the newspapers because one person leaving at a time doesn't matter. But he says some of the smartest people around him have actually quit because they get in there with idealism. They think, I will do great work, I will report on this, I will report on that. But they realize that no one gives a shit about that, man. You are just, it's a quantity of your production, and you have to write about the things the editor wants you to write about, and there are certain things you can't write about, and we'll come to that later, and so on and so forth. And many of them are leaving because the point is that, intelligence, talent, they are also scarce resources. And if someone has those things, they can do a lot with their intelligence and imagination and talent and ability. So why should you necessarily stay in what can appear often to be a thankless, deadbeat profession? And this also then further, affects the quality of what is being produced. Because then if the quality is bad, then the readers stop consuming you. And if the readers stop consuming you, then there is no incentive to invest in good quality people and to care about that instead. So, that vicious cycle again plays itself out. So there is certainly a crisis in quality, which leads to the subject of my next chapter. There's a crisis of trust.
I want to add two things to this. One is a direct connection into the issue of wages. My friend Ashima Sharma has been emphasizing that journalists in India are rather singularly underpaid, and it's difficult to find the solution. How do you square this circle? How do you find a career path? How do you get to a normal middle class life anymore as a journalist today? Tia Nainan long said to me that to get to quality, you need investments in process. That we need to be putting in enough man hours at a sufficiently high price per man hour to get to one well reported, well fact checked story. So, what we see as the outcome of a story in the Financial Times or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal is ridiculous levels of effort. So, I remember once Siddharth Mukherjee wrote an article in the New Yorker, and he spoke with me for that, and I did a video call with him, and he used some sentences of mine in the story that he was writing. This is the guy who's the author of the emperor of maladies. This was a question
The
about
gene.
the death, the excess deaths associated with COVID in India. We had one of the first papers on that. I was astonished at the level of effort that the New Yorker magazine went through to fact check it with me. They came to me with everything that he said that was attributed to me. Do you agree that that was said? Fine, that I'll own up to it. No, then they were not satisfied. Show us the paper. Show us that you have backup for the claims that you made. We'll not take your word for it. So it's like we think of fact checking that you should hear the same thing from two sources and the sources should not repudiate it. The kind of labor power that the New Yorker magazine put in for just one paragraph out of a 20,000 word story was astonishing to me, that they really put in a lot of effort. TN Nainan said to me that the only one that can do this is Bennett Coleman and Company. This is before Bennett Coleman and Company abandoned their quality piece and they just went tabloid. He said, we in India are stuck because everybody else can't afford quality and Bennett Coleman will not do quality. So he says there is nobody in the Indian ecosystem that cares about that deeply reported, deeply fact-checked. It may be a 1,000-word story, but for example, if you see the recent Wall Street Journal story about Trump, where Trump has sued them for $10 billion, you and I just know that there is no way the Wall Street Journal makes a move like this without being factual to the extreme. Like they would have really done hard work for an important story like this. It helps that Donald Trump is famous for suing newspapers. So before anybody goes through a project like this, they will have done their hard work. And so you and I will give 100% benefit of doubt to the Wall Street Journal that you've done your work. These are not things that you would do lightly. So we in India are in this trap that there is a chronically under-resourced journalism ecosystem which achieves low quality, and then we turn around and say, therefore, nobody is willing to pay for it. And that's a vicious cycle. Now, I think that these are things that have been seen in other parts of capitalism. This problem is not unique. You can have endemically bad quality medicines. Okay, you can have endemically bad quality cars. You can have cars that break down. You can have cars that kill people. And the answer is that the free market system will in time find those long range investments, that somebody will come in with a chunk of money and say, look, for 5 years we are investing in this, we'll build that reputation and then we'll monetize it, we'll charge for subscriptions. So on one hand, I do see the problem. We are under investing in quality and that creates a chronic inability to monetize, and then we are stuck, we're in a vicious cycle. I remain hopeful that this is a venture capital problem, that you need people who will come through with 100 crore and 1,000 crore, who will say, look, for 5 years, we're going to push quality, and then we'll discover who are the subscribers who are willing to pay for it. What do you think?
I'm a little skeptical about that particular thing, and I'll come to reasons why when we talk about the future in our last chapter. But I want to zero in on the word chronic. That chronic is very much the right word. That this is very much a vicious cycle. You mentioned the New Yorker. New Yorker is legendary for his fact checking, and WHJ NYT will, of course, do pretty rigorous work as well over there. And in India, instead, what you have, like, there was a magazine which was known for long form journalism, but a lot of their long, deep profiles were actually hit pieces, where the journalist right at the start had an agenda that I want to take this guy down. Most of the quotes would be from unnamed people who would say, I worked with so and so did this, and that would be the bulk of the story. And stories like that have even won awards. And it was pretty disgraceful. And as someone who's read the New Yorker from the time I was a child, anyone who's exposed to that kind of rigor and those kind of standards, you immediately know that what the hell is going on over here even. And when the quality is that low, that affects trust. Readers stop trusting you, and that's the next crisis we're going to talk about.
Okay, Amit, take us to trust.
So actually, much of what I want to say about the crisis of trust is already covered. If your quality goes down, then obviously readers stop trusting you. If you are chasing the bottom line, readers stop trusting you. If you're going after clickbait, readers stop trusting you, because you'll pick those subjects which give you clickbait. You will take those stances which get you to clickbait. See, journalism is not just about reporting a story well. Part of journalism is choosing what stories to report. In that choice is a bias, in that choice is a preference. And when you're just optimizing for clickbait and appealing to sensationalism and all of that, that affects what is going on there. And readers will eventually turn away. Readers will have, the short attention span kicks in there. We crave depth, which is why the seen and the unseen is as popular as it is. We crave depth. But we are not, most of the media, I remember Prem once said to me in an episode with me that the Indian media is a mile wide and an inch deep. And that is so true. Most of the media is a mile wide because they're chasing shallow clickbait, and they're an inch deep for a variety of reasons. The other reason that trust has gone down is actually not so much that quality has gone down, but that we have become more discerning of low quality. Like there's a phrase I love called Gell-Mann amnesia. Michael Crichton once pointed out something about his friend Murray Gell-Mann, and Murray Gell-Mann had told him this, therefore is called Gell-Mann amnesia, the great physicist. And Gell-Mann had said that, look, when I read something in a newspaper about a subject I know well, I will know it's crap, but I will trust the rest of the newspaper. So in my field, I will know this reporter knows nothing, but I will trust the rest of the newspaper. And that's Gell-Mann amnesia. The idea there being that if they reported your subject wrong, why do you assume they reported everything else right? Now, this is an endemic problem in India, especially where journalists tend to be generalists, right? And in a sense, there's no way around this. It's a breadth versus depth trade-off, and you have to arrive at the right point of the trade-off. And in India, we simply haven't. Now, what happened 2000 onwards, when bloggers came on the scene, for example, is that specialists finally began to have a voice. Specialists had the means of production. You would have an economics reporter writing about economics in a newspaper, and you would have Tyler Cowen writing about the same thing in Marginal Revolution. And you'd have other great economists writing on their blogs. So you're getting the specialist point of view, So it then became apparent to a lot of people that, hey, yaar, if I want to learn about medicine, I will read Eric Topol on Twitter, or I will read his articles, or I will read his books. I don't need to read a report by someone who has spoken to him, but perhaps has had to do a story in a hurry, doesn't understand the subject well, etc., etc. You know how often you would have read an economics report in the newspaper, which is complete nonsense. So this is a sort of a realization of low quality, and this explains why the audience then started turning away. Like if I want to understand what is on the cutting edge of medicine, I would rather go to an Eric Topol than read the Times of India. In fact, the Times of India would be entirely the wrong place to go to. I mean, there are some good health reporters, frankly. So I don't want to overstate that as well. There are many good people working out there in these fields, but by and large, the quality is abysmal and there is a lack of trust. Secondly, we are in narrative battles which mainstream media itself has fallen for. I don't really want to do heroes and villains, so I won't take any names, but there are otherwise well-respected publications in the West as well, which I am appalled by at looking at the directions that they've gone, the sort of ideological capture and their willing entry into a particular set of narrative battles, because you get clicks and you get subscriptions even when you rile up people and make them feel strongly about something. And people get riled up and feel strongly about their ideological biases and so on and so forth. And therefore playing to those and going on those extremes, and the incentives drive you there. But that might get you the plaudits of a small minority of people whose line you are taking, but everybody else stops trusting you. Which is why, in my writing course, an advice I often give to those who want to be opinion writers is that one thing you must do in every piece is steelman the opposing point of view. Like, don't put a strawman version of the opposite point of view. Steelman it, say it in such a good way that your opponent would say, that's exactly how I would have put it, and then argue against it. And the reason for that is not just that it builds your own intellectual rigor, but it gives you that credibility with the reader. That this guy is not some partisan hack who is turning out the party line. This guy has thought deeply about the problem. And you don't see enough of this at all in the mainstream media. So there is this crisis in trust in the sense that, can I believe what the mainstream media is telling me? Everything is sensationalized. Recently, there was a plane crash, which is kind of fresh in everyone's mind while we are doing this. The Air India plane that crashed outside Ahmedabad. I won't go into details, but the coverage of all of the mainstream media of that in India has absolutely appalled me. It is hysterical, it is sensational, it is not nuanced in any way. There's no critical thinking being used, there's no independent thinking being applied. And on issue after issue after issue, like whenever this episode airs, whatever are the hot button issues of the day, go and look at what mainstream media is reporting on that, and chances are that it'll seem really amateurish and bad. So the crisis of quality has led to a crisis of trust, where we have to look at other sources, and then you begin to wonder that where is this going? Is spiraling out of control.
Amit, the chapter title is The Crisis of Power. Explain.
So by power, I mean the power of the state. We function in India. The state is a powerful force over here, and that affects what our media reports on and doesn't report on. It affects the incentives of the media, and it is one reason for why quality, in fact, has gone down, why certain things can be written about and certain things can't, and why the public has also lost a lot of trust because they see this game playing out. Now, in the 1970s, when emergency happened, you correctly spoke about the blank page that Ramnath Goenka put out in the Indian Express bravely. But by and large, the entire mainstream media capitulated so badly that L.K. Advani famously said about journalists that they were asked to bend, they chose to crawl. Right? That's the way that the game was. Nevertheless, people like Ramnath Goenka were fighting against this. An important sort of point Prem made when he was chatting with me is that in those days, a media house still had some clout and independence which went beyond the state. So a Goenka could do everything that he did with the Indian Express, where they were consistently not just against a particular government. Of course, he was against the emergency and helped the Janata Party win. But even after that, all through the 80s, he basically spoke the truth to power. He hired Arun Shuri. Arun Shuri did some remarkable investigative journalism in that time. A chill goes up my spine when I think of those. Where are those days? And that was happening. Equally, the Singhanias started the Indian Post because they started it as a hedge against the state. They were involved in a battle with the Wadiyas and all kinds of shenanigans were going on. So at that time, media owners would actually invest in media because it gave them some clout, it gave them a platform, and they could say the government, don't mess with us too much, we are part of the media, we can also write against you. And that was the game that was going on. And where that is completely inverted, as Prem pointed out, as you and I know, is that today no one does that. You can't hedge against the state. The state is all powerful. The state has too many levers. And essentially today you have big media houses being bought over by corporate barons. And again, we won't take any names, not required, by corporate barons because they want to do the government a favor. Because it is one of the ways in which they are showing that they are excellent crony capitalists, and this is what I will do for you. You show me what you can do for me. Now, this really works in two ways, right? There is a stick and there is a carrot, always. And the stick is predictable. The stick is, for example, all our big media houses are not just media houses, they have diversified interests. There's one big media house which might also have chemical factories. You can send the ED to do a raid on the chemical factory today. There are 50 reasons, in fact, to raid a chemical factories, and you can easily shut up anyone, and that has a chilling effect. This is a huge stick that the state can wield. I remember two prominent examples of this, and many journalists that we know won't talk about this in public, but all of us know what's going on, and I'll talk about both of them. And both of them, in fact, have to do with the ST group, as it happens. That when Mint first started, its editor was Raju Narisetti, and at one point in time, he wrote something that pissed off Chidambaram, and Chidambaram had him sacked. Now, this is crazy. A minister in a government has the editor of one of the biggest newspapers in the country summarily sacked, and he left the country, right? And many years later, I'm not just talking about one party, that was the UPA. Many years later, under the BJP, Arun Jaitley had Bobby Ghosh sacked. Bobby Ghosh was doing a hate tracker which was tracking hate crimes for the Hindustan Times, and Jaitley allegedly did not like it and got him sacked, and he had to leave. And two huge editors, two big names. This is not some dinky little city magazine, and of course even that would be wrong. But imagine the amount of power you wield when you could do that. Recently, and Shefali was telling me this anecdote, this story, rather anecdote, makes it sound like something pleasant. This story that the Financial Times carried out an expose of a leading business family in this country, and there were like 5 bylines. There's a main writer, and then there is with additional reporting by whatever. All the Indian names in that byline were visited by the police within a day, saying, whatever, under whatever excuse. And the main reporter, the foreigner who was posted here and who was FT's correspondent here, she apparently left and went back to her previous beat in whichever country she was in, because of the harassment that happened. So this is a stick that can be used, that they can, they can carry out a raid on you at any point in time. They can figure out a way to lock you up. This is in fact why that the people who are showing a spine and who are fighting this are some of the smaller people. Because, as was it Dylan or Joan Baez, if you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose, right? Or Chris Christopherson, whoever it was, great quote. So, if you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. If the only thing you're doing is this independent little outlet and you're driven by purpose and passion and you want to make someone's life better off, you can resist for a little bit longer, and the state might well feel that you're too small to do anything about, but they can lock you up at any time they want. So this is the stick. This affects a lot of reporting, and this was always there. It's not just this government. I remember in the late 90s and the aughties, even under other regimes, stories on a particular family were simply not allowed. I remember a friend of mine did this great investigative story for a daily newspaper, and it was spiked at the last moment, and everyone said, "Oh my God, it's amazing, dhamaka kar dega." But that is the very reason it was sort of spiked. So that is a stick. What is a carrot? The carrot takes us back to the crisis of money. The carrot is government advertising. Most people don't freaking realize the role that government advertising plays. There are many publications that survive only because government advertising is coming in, and PSUs and government departments are constantly advertising there. Political parties are advertising there with public money, and that's the reason they survive. And this is a carrot that, hey, don't mess with me and we'll keep the funds coming. But it can become a stick. That if you mess with me, I'll withdraw that. And then you have an existential crisis. So what do you do about this and how do you get past this? So dealing with power in India is a problem. I don't just want to say that, hey, media in X country or Y place is so good and look at us, we suck. There is a reason for that, that also has to do with where we are located and what our ecosystem is and what the Indian state is like.
Just to add to this, in addition to the government as an advertiser in the media, is the phenomenon of the revenues for media companies from running events. That quid pro quo seems to be that you'll get some famous government figures who will come to the conference, and for all the fears that you've described, the corporations want proximity to the government and they come through with corporate sponsorships. So that revenue stream equally is something where the government has a veto power, that if prominent government figures will stop coming to your conferences, then the large corporations will not come through with sponsorships, and then that revenue stream will dry out. So I think that's the second dimension. On the same note, I have been surprised and startled at the presence of sitting government employees on opinion pages of the newspaper. Okay, so it seems to me that the government has plenty megaphone, and they have Doordarshan and they have PIB, and whenever they wish they can run a press conference. So it's like they've got all the megaphones that they want, but they're eating up column inches in the newspaper. And nobody in their reasonable mind will ever read the propaganda of a government as a serious opinion piece, or it's not interesting. Like, nobody wants to know the positions of the government. It's a PIB press release. It's not interesting. But you see, that damages the value proposition of the newspaper. It's like, why will I pay money for a newspaper? Why will I pay a subscription for a newspaper if you're going to give me Doordarshan? Okay, so the government propaganda is free. Like, you can run a PIB, you can run Doordarshan, you can run YouTube shows and so on. But once that civil servant material and politician material starts coming into the newspaper, it may seem expedient to the newspaper, but I feel it undermines the case for the revenue model. That why will people pay for it? So, Amit, You may discuss the problems of tribals in 24 Parganas, but this card carrying economist wants to see everything through the lens of incentives. So let's take all these pieces and show me an incentives based way to look at this.
So the crisis of incentives is something that I think about, and a lot of this is actually covered earlier. Like a lot of your incentives come from money. How do you make money? Once you get in that vicious cycle where you stop producing quality content and everything is about ROI and you're going after clickbait, that becomes a problem. And that is one source of bad incentives. Another source of bad incentives comes from power, where we've discussed everything. There is a stick, there is a carrot. The stick has a chilling effect. What do you do? You got to be careful, and you got to play your cards right. An example, and I'd really like gentle readers to put in the comments what other kinds of incentives they can think of. For example, one that I think about is something that was explained to me by our friend Ashok Malik, who did an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me on this, where he spoke about television, right? First, he brought up the point that television news is appalling, right? We know this. The content is absolutely appalling. I think we did the episode some 7 years ago. Today it is even worse than it was. I haven't watched news television for I think 13, 14 years. It's unwatchable. You have screens full of these little boxes with people screaming, and it's madness. It's very bad. We all agree it's bad. Why is it bad? And his point was, it is bad because of government regulation. Because when these television channels were sprouting, one good way for them to make money was through subscriptions, whether it is through set-top boxes or whatever the means is, but it's through subscriptions. He gave the exact figures in that episode, I've forgotten now, but a significant chunk of the revenue of channels in the West are from subscriptions, which means if you want, you can invest in quality content which costs a lot, like a National Geographic would, and you can charge a premium for it for the customers who, there might not be so many of them, but remember the distinction between shallow and deep engagement. The deep engagement guys, they will gladly pay. So individual customers can therefore pay, and therefore you can make your decisions that these are the niches that I'll focus on. I'll experiment with this, I'll experiment with that. You are also doing what in any way is the reality of today, that the best way to monetize is to monetize directly from the consumers. The government put price caps. They put ridiculous price caps, which means that after paying a massive license fee to get your television license and to start a channel, after putting in all of the capital investment required, the subscription that you're allowed to charge is so little that you have no option but to rely on advertising. And if you are relying on advertising, it inevitably becomes a race to the bottom. You've already invested so much that you are going to do shouty, shouty, screamy, screamy, Bollywood, Shollywood. This is also why, by the way, our FM stations are the way they are. If you look at, say, the market of New York, in New York, you have 80, 90, I forget the number, many FM stations are catering to different niches, they're doing funky things. Over here, our FM stations have to pay a massive license to be able to start the station, and on top of that, there is regulation that doesn't allow them to do news or politics. So therefore, having paid those license fees, they can't then do a Bruce Springsteen channel, for example, or even a Ghazal channel, frankly. You have no option but to do mainstream Bollywood and cater to whatever you think the masses might want. And I say you think the masses might want because it's so fuzzy that often we don't even know. There are all kinds of wrong assumptions that drive the actions of these people for many years as their revenues keep falling and they can't figure out why. So these incentives also need to be looked at. No one would think that, oh, television news is so bad. Isme government ka kya role hai yaar? This is like private corporates who are producing bad news. But you go to the root of it and something else is going on there. So, the ecosystem is full of bad incentives, and the purpose of this chapter is not to detail them all because there are too many of them, but it is to draw your attention to the importance of those incentives and to urge you, gentle readers, to always look out for them and indeed point out a few of them in the comments of this to us, if you can think of any.
On a related note, Ashima Sharma was telling me about the problems of embedded journalism. Okay, so you start at the idea that a journalist works with the United States Department of Defense to cover the war in Iraq. Okay, and that is a quid pro quo, that the person gets access, and in return there will be a certain vetting of stories, but also a quid pro quo, that people will be kind to the host that enabled your story. That's happening in many parts of India. If you're going to cover Kashmir, if you're going to cover Naxalite districts, if you're going to cover some problems in the northeast states, it has become a cheap and convenient mechanism for the journalist to be embedded into the Indian state. Indeed, many times now the Indian state blocks any journalist from reporting on difficulties in the country. So the only way to get in is embedded journalism. But that embedded journalism then creates the incentives that the messages that will be carried will end up being closer to PIB and Doordarshan. So it's back to that damage to the work that comes from proximity to the state. And then you're back to that first problem, that why would people pay for this?
And off the cuff, another bad incentive I can think of is the power of social media, right? Everybody wants to do work that goes viral on social media. And what goes viral on social media? News alone doesn't. Strong, polarized viewpoints do. You know, one of the classic values that we learnt about in journalism is that there has to be a separation between news and opinion. That the news pages and the opinion pages are completely different and there's no communication between them. They can't influence each other. You know, so in the 1990s, I remember you used to say that, oh, okay, the New York Times is slightly left of center and the Wall Street Journal is slightly right of center, but that only applied to their opinion pages. The news pages were outstanding and you couldn't tell them apart. They were incredibly rigorous, well fact-checked, all of that was going on. And to a large extent in the Western media, the news reportage is still like that. Those values are maintained over here, over there. But over here, there is often the temptation to editorialize, which you should never do in a news piece. A news piece is you just report. And obviously, every news piece by default carries perspective because you are choosing to report on a thing instead of something else. And you are choosing to report on aspects of it and not other aspects of it. So there is already some perspective and opinion baked into it. But regardless of that, you have to try to be as dispassionate and balanced as you can. But instead, you see a blurring of these boundaries. And that, I think, again, is because of the way incentives work. That if you're a young journalist, you want everyone to retweet your piece. So even if you're reporting on something, you can't resist doing a little bit of virtue signaling. So I feel this might be a small thing, a small factor that plays out sometimes.
But more generally, we know well that the machine of social media amplifies anger and emotion. And so even if an individual journalist was not narrowly maximizing for that, it would end up becoming the selection bias, that if social media filters a large number of dispassionate pieces, the pieces that trigger anger and trigger emotion will generate more engagement. And then some bin counter will be keeping score. I believe that inside Fox News, at the office, at the reporter's den, there is a big screen which has continuously updated data about views. So
Wow.
they live and die by views. So now that's just the selection bias, that they put out something, the social media decides what gets the million views. And then people are partly consciously thinking, what would I do? What would I do? Or a quiet, dispassionate person loses their job and the anger and emotion person wins and gets big bonuses. So the career path of journalists is to bring in social media types, the anger game, the social justice game, the emotions game. That's what gets fanned the moment you bring any connection to social media.
What you just told me makes my blood boil. Like if I was heading a newsroom, my rule would be we don't look at views. We simply don't do that. We don't discuss them. In fact, my rule for this show, Ajay Shah, which you keep breaking, is I don't want to know the analytics. And you are a geek, so you'll sometimes look at them, but we do nothing on the basis of those. Like a friend recently asked me, how's Seen Unseen doing? What are the latest figures? I kid you not, I haven't looked at them for a year and a half. You know, I simply don't care. You know, the show went fortnightly. This person asked me, how has that affected your things? I said, I don't know. I don't care. I do the work I do. I'm not a circus monkey. So, you know.
In about 2006, I had this discussion with TN Nainan, and I asked that, would it be wise for you to send back some data to your columnists about the views? Okay, I was stupid. And he said, absolutely not. It would damage the process. And now I understand perfectly that he was right. He said this has to be the aesthetic and intellectual judgment of the editorial team, that what's a good editorial page, what's a good op-ed. Okay, we should build it out of our minds and our philosophy. We should never look at the views.
And he's a very wise man, because I remember this incident from 5 years ago where I was chatting with a friend who was the editor of something which is like the features section of a major this thing. And one of her columnists was someone she despised, a misogynist asshole. And nobody likes him. And, you know, one of us asked her that, if you don't like him, why do you carry him? and she said he gets more views than everybody else combined. And it was like, but that is the world we live in. So this is going to be a brief chapter because I've again touched on aspects of this in the past. But the last crisis that I want to talk about today is the crisis of attention. In modern times, attention is deeply fragmented and split across many things, often split across many things for good reason. Like 25 years ago, my mornings would begin by reading a newspaper, whether it was Times of India or Indian Express or whatever. You're having breakfast, you read a newspaper for a while. And today it's not like that. Today we are looking at our phones, and we might even be doing worthy things on our phones. I'm not saying everything we do on our phones is wrong. It's only about 99.8% is wrong. But uh, today we are looking at our phones, our attention is fragmented. A lot of the time we are scrolling, swiping. That's become the rhythm of our thinking. And there are so many things that can capture our attention. Like excellent YouTube shows. Thank you for watching this. Like and subscribe. We never say like and subscribe. You're supposed to say that. Like and subscribe. Ajay looks at the numbers. So let's see if my saying this moves the needle. You're tracking it, right? Right. You must track it. If it does, we'll say it in every episode. No, we won't. So this was a digression. Where was I? Yeah. So where was I?
Newspaper.
My
Reading the newspaper, scrolling, swiping.
Yeah, my attention went to hell. See what just happened? These are bad habits. And this is a challenge for newspapers, that, attention is deeply fragmented. That's number one. That's a problem. That earlier you could be guaranteed कि हर सुबह न्यूज़पेपर जाता है, person is reading it, advertiser might also get some bang for buck, though you can't measure it. Today, like I don't take physical newspapers anymore, and even those who do, are they really looking at them, or are they looking into the smartphone and what's really going on? I know you're an exception. Outlier arguments will not be made here. The second problem with attention is our attention is often determined by algorithms. Algorithms will take us in directions which feed whatever we have shown interest in. If we click on subject X, 50 things in subject X will then come up. Like one scenario that I think of sometimes and that fills me with worry is, imagine you're a 15-year-old boy and somebody sends you a piece which is clickbait of the most misogynist, rabble-rousing tribal type. And you click on that, and because you click on that, your algorithm gives you more content like that, and you keep clicking on that, and you think that is the world, and that is the truth, and that is your reality, and you are in that bubble. And this is why often, two people meeting each other, two young people meeting each other is also in a sense two algorithms meeting each other, or the two results of two algorithms meeting each other, and there may not be a meeting point or a reasonable way to speak, where because I have one world and you have another world, I will think you are evil and you will think I am evil. And from those worldviews, that is exactly the case. It's exactly reasonable to think in that way. And like I tried this once where I decided I'll go into kooky right-wing thinking on YouTube and see what the ecosystem is like. So I opened an incognito window where I logged in from another Gmail account. So I today have two completely separate YouTubes with no connection to each other. And they're completely separate in terms of what they show me. There has never been a common thing that has come up. They are different worlds. And when we talk about the mainstream media as being a package, आपके पास आर्ट्स पेज है, बुक्स पेज है. When I wrote for the Times of India, when I wrote against demonetization, someone else also wrote a column for demonetization, which is as it should be. You're getting different points of view on one page. Though those times changed, but let's not go there. But you're getting different points of view. That's the job of the newspaper. Whereas if you're just in an algorithmic world, your knowledge of the world narrows down to one tiny sliver, and even that may not be true.
Yeah. You tried to shrug me off and dismiss me. I will not have it. Okay?
Don't have it.
I am an outlier, but I consider these to be good practices, and these are important life lessons we shall give every reader. I subscribe to 3 physical papers. I get the Business Standard, I get the Indian Express, and I get the Mint. And they show up in my house every morning. In order to beat the traffic, I go early to the office. So I try to be out by 8:15, 8:30, and I reach the office like at 9 or before. And then at the office, I sit with a cup of coffee like a civilized person, and I read the physical papers. Okay, it is my practice today. Why? Okay, my reason one is, it's a broad scan of news and information, but equally important is everything that you just said, that I want to get out of my bubble. I respect and value these people. I respect the editors. Okay, I think they're good people, they mean well, they're trying to grow up the world. Yeah, I can disagree with them on many things, but it's interesting, even cursorily, to look at the design of the page. There are priorities embedded in the font size of the headline. There are little bits of information that I will zoom into. I will read some of the columns. For every employee of a newspaper, I have an idea for you. On every single story, you should have a QR code. Okay, because folks like me, I take a picture of the physical article and sort of beam it out to a few people saying, what do you think? Tell me more. Do you know something about it? It's lovely. It sort of extends my knowledge that I'm not only reading the newspaper, but I'm then reaching out and engaging with others about it. The new mod cons that can be layered on top of this is to leave a Google Gemini audio prompt alive while you're reading the paper. So you're reading an article, you'll ask him a question, he'll give you a fact. So suddenly you're able to connect up many pieces. So I find this to be a great experience. I value it. I do it essentially every morning. If I wake up on time, I'm doing this every morning.
I thought of a bad joke, but I shouldn't say it. But I'll say it. She'll cut it out, obviously. And it is that the newspapers are also useful when you run out of water in the morning and you're stuck in the loo.
Amit, you have told us a great story. I think all of us have a better understanding of the predicament, the feedback loops, okay? Because these problems don't arise out of thin air. They arise because you're grinding away with incentives and feedback loops, and that gives us a deeper structural media theory, so to speak, about how we got here. So what is your sense of the future? How does this go in the next 20 years?
So, when I shared the episode design with you, you said that this is very bleak. Give us something a little more hopeful. And I said, we'll do it in the last chapter. I lied, right? There isn't much that I can be hopeful about, but I will also say that, I didn't completely lie, but I will also say that I, we did an episode called The World in 2050, as if looking into the future is easy. And on some of those abstract issues, we had a lot of fun doing it. Over here, I can't imagine how things change. What I do realize is that all of the situations in the world, the incentives that led to journalism with values, that led to these institutions no longer exist. And the mainstream everywhere, not just in media, but in entertainment and across domains, the mainstream everywhere is crumbling and is irrelevant. But nothing has taken its place. There is a lag between the circumstances of the world changing and reality changing to correspond with that. And by reality, I mean in terms of institutions and in terms of just understanding that in this new world, we still want information, we still want truth, we still want a watchdog, etc., etc. How does the texture of our lives change to account for these wants if we continue wanting them, when the old ways are clearly not working? So I really don't know, but let me think aloud for a bit. One, what you're going to see, what you are seeing is many solo creators who are taking over some of these functions. Like today, for example, Substack is a great place. Right, Yasha Monk started his publication there. Barry Weiss and gang started their publication there, and you've got good things happening on Substack where independent creators are going out there and they're
Amit
making a lot
Varma
of money.
started his newsletter there.
And hasn't written a post for a year and a half. But yeah, and I never meant to monetize it. I have some 10,000 people who must be opening their email every day wondering, Amit ka kuch nahi aaya bhai. But no, but I'll be regular with my newsletter at some point. But at the time of recording, it's been more than a year. I haven't written anything. But leave that aside. I'm saying the avenues are open. And Substack is actually great because if you're a solo creator, you are actually accumulating your audience. In the past, you couldn't do that. Your work would appear in fractured ways in different places, but you can't collect your audience. Whereas with Substack, all your email IDs of your subscribers actually belong to you. When you go to another site, you can take them and you can try and monetize that. You can sell your future products to them, like courses, or if you're going on YouTube. So the technology allows you to now carry your community around if you're a creator. But to come back to the context of journalism, you do have people taking over some of those functions, like the sense making function. The world is complicated, help me make sense of it. Both Shefali and Samarth mentioned Dhruv Rathi as someone who does some of that. Now, one may not exactly, let's not get into the quality of what he does, but the point is what the function that he is attempting to perform should be performed by mainstream media, the filtering and sense making function. And clearly there is demand for it. If you look at his numbers, there is demand for it. Mohak Mangal is another young man with a YouTube channel who does exactly that and works pretty hard and does a pretty good job of it. So you have these solo creators working. But my thing is this, that okay, sense making is one thing. If you're going to create content on a subject everyone cares about, like cricket or Bollywood, that is another thing. My deeper concern is something is vanishing. The city beats, the municipality beat, Juhu ke galiyon mein kya ho raha hai, even the RBI beat, those are vanishing. Where are those creators? And Shefali and I tried to think about what happens to those creators who might now be in mainstream media, but if they want to go independent. So let us say that you are covering a city beat or a municipality beat for a local newspaper, like say a Midday, and you decide, I want to go and become a creator. So you go to YouTube and you become a creator. First of all, it is very difficult and unfair to expect you to do this, because you have probably learned reporting and you've learned your beat. Now you have to learn how to make videos. You have to learn marketing. You have to learn how to grow an audience. You have to learn how to fucking make thumbnails, which is such a horrible process. You have to learn all of this shit, right? It is unfair to expect that person to do it. Secondly, for that person to then survive as an independent creator, they will have to start caring about clicks, because incentives, right? And even in subtle ways, even if they are idealistic and they say ki, no, I'm just going to do my little beat, you get tempted. There's just no way around it. You get tempted and you subconsciously you start catering to those needs. You start rationalizing. That's a flow that you have to go with. That institutional arrangement that you worked in a particular place, which was a very big tent, which did some things profitably and some things unprofitably, and didn't know and didn't care, like TN9 in your earlier example, didn't know and didn't care what is doing well, but understood that all of this is worth doing. That the hypothetical individual we speak of may be driven by an individual sense of purpose, but remember that phrase, civic purpose, that there is a wider purpose to it, that you might put out content today that no one reads today, that no one's going to pay you money for, but it is an invaluable part of the documenting of humanity, of history. It is a first draft of a history that will otherwise never get written. It is important to have that repository out there. And I don't have an answer to the question of where is that going to come from, because I think many of those beats will vanish. I think there will be individuals who will be driven by the desire to do good independent journalism, and they will continue one way or the other to do all of that, right? And some of them write books as well, and etc., etc. But you can't rely on individual passion and drive, because that is a few outliers. What is an institutional arrangement where you can build an ecosystem of such people, which then brings about a virtuous cycle, that more and more people come into it? You read something great, you say, my God, what a great story, I want to be like that. And then 10 years later, you're a journalist yourself and you're doing that. And that's the way the world should go, and it's not going that way. So I don't have, I can't be optimistic about it, except for the general optimism that technology empowers individuals, has given us a means of production. New ways of thinking about these problems will emerge quite clearly from much younger people who can see the world in different ways. We are perhaps too ossified in our thinking, and new solutions will emerge, and the problem will eventually get solved. I mean, there may be a lag, but it won't be a full stop.
Yeah. I want to say two things in addition to this. So, the first is that what you called an institution, the word that went off in my mind was firms. Okay, so you want to bring teams of people together. Somebody knows how to make the thumbnails, somebody knows how to record the videos, somebody knows how to do the A/B testing of the thumbnails, and you put teams together. So
I just want to interrupt and say no one knows how to make thumbnails. Everybody's winging it, no one knows. But anyway, let that be. That is my specific rant.
So what we need is firms, and then you get back to the whole business model question, that who are these firms, that what's new media going to look like? Because so far everything that has been done as new media is disappointing. And on a global scale, what has worked, like the admirable success stories, are really old media transforming themselves for the new age. It is the revenue streams and the business models of the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Economist. These are really the demos of what you can do in the new world. The second thing I want to say is drawing on our friend Suyash Rai. Uh, Suyash tells a relatively more optimistic story, which runs like this. He says that, look, it does appear that the rise of the internet was a disaster and many, many things went to hell. That the quality of the intellectual landscape, the nature of the conversation really went badly. And today we feel terrible and we don't see a way out. That nobody can ever turn the clock back on all the technological transformation that has taken place. But like, my God, it has really messed up. When you say sentences like the center does not hold, it is chilling. It is the destruction of the society. Everything we see in the world around us, all the problems have come from that one core, that we lost our center. But Suyash argues that when you go deep in the history of media technologies, this has actually happened many times. So he says, if you look at radio, radio was a subversive, offensive weapon in the hands of folks like Mussolini and Hitler. And at first, when that innovation came about, it was very, very influential and impactful. And the demagogues took to it first. And it had a huge impact on society. Over time, it mellowed, that the people understood. The people are not indefinitely stupid. The people are stupid for some time. That radio made a tremendous impact at first. Like, you cannot imagine that little box with a crackling sound and somebody saying burn the Jews. Okay, it really has an impact. But over the years, radio got normalized and human culture absorbed it and assimilated it. And this is the story that has happened many times in history. Consider WhatsApp. Okay, you and I know a time when people thought that, if a WhatsApp message came saying burn the Jews, it was gospel truth. Okay, it had to be taken very seriously. Today, like, everybody knows WhatsApp is bullshit. Like, nobody takes messages coming on WhatsApp seriously. I mean, IIT Bombay 1987 group, I don't take it that seriously. So I think our culture evolves and we become more immune to things that were subversive when they first came along. So for these reasons, the modern tools of the algorithm and the filters and social media may in time become less damaging if, and only if, the culture evolves in ways that recognize their power and undo some of the damage. So, if all of us will do more critical thinking, that if somebody gives us a URL on Twitter, if we bring that suitable sense of skepticism and hesitation when we click on it, that's it. Then suddenly you've actually begun on the journey of clawing back from that place. Okay, Amit, oh mighty media theorist, tell us what we should be reading.
I am none of those things, but I am also not a Bengali economist. I'm somewhere in between those two extremes. What we should be, I'll recommend 3 books on the media itself. One is an excellent book I must have recommended before on this show called Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, written in the early part of the 20th century, and outstanding book. One should read it. Another is Understanding Media by Marshall McLuhan, or in fact, The Medium is a Message by Marshall McLuhan, absolutely worth reading. And finally, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. So these are my 3 recommendations for today. So, oh ye gentle reader, go out and read these, but before you read these, like, subscribe, share. See, I tried one more time. You're going to follow the data, right? Good.
And I have a recommendation.
Tell us.
Roger Waters has an album called Amused to Death.
You're just piggybacking on words.
Actually, Roger Waters read the Neil Postman book and then wrote the album.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Did you make that up?
No, I'm dead
You
serious.
did?
I'm not just an LLM.
Okay.